Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Crosshairs, the program at ThePrint, where we discuss the big national security or geopolitical issue of the week concerning India. The biggest story coming up in just a few days is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's state visit to the United States. This is a relationship that's been much talked about, and you're going to hear a ton about it in coming days. But I'm joined here by Dr. Tricia Bacon, expert on all things counterterrorism, particularly to do with South Asia, um, uh, uh, to discuss one relatively narrow but under-discussed aspect of the relationship, which is what it means for counterterrorism, the way India deals with insurgencies, with jihadist threats and other problems in the immediate neighborhood. Thanks for making the time, Tricia. I know you're at the other end of the world and have a flight to catch soon. But first question, I think a big picture one. Uh, there's been endless conversation about the sort of state of the India-United States relationship. Lots of pessimists. Dr. Ashley Tell is recently writing an article that some saw fairly or unfairly as a sign of mounting skepticism in the United States about the depth of this relationship. Lots of other people in the United States pushing back against that perception. Where would you say the relationship stands in terms of meeting expectations?
That's a really interesting point too. Where is it in terms of expectations? Not necessarily where should it be, but where is it in terms of expectations? And I think that the response to Ashley Tellis's article tells us a lot about where expectations are. That perhaps in some ways the expectations are too high. There's a lot of enthusiasm for an improved relationship. It's certainly the direction of that relationship. But the pace and the nature of that improvement going forward is an area where there's probably room for a little bit of mediating of expectations, because sometimes unfulfilled expectations are almost worse than having modest expectations. And so I think in Washington, with the embrace of India, especially vis-a-vis China, there's some people working on India now who haven't worked on India in the past in Washington. And so they may not take into account some of India's sensitivities and some of its other interests in their enthusiasm to embrace this relationship. So while there is pushback when people try to tamp down expectations, I also think that there's utility in having optimism, but also tempering expectations in terms of the depth and the rapidity that the relationship improves.
So I'm going to come back to that last point you made in a second, but let's start with the eternal question, Pakistan, which Indians often might say, oh, this is about China and so on and so forth, but this always lurks in the room like some ghost that won't go away. Pakistan in a state of meltdown, a lot of worry about what that will mean in terms of the possible resurgence of jihadi groups, what it might mean in terms of the stability of the state, which is after all a nuclear weapons armed state. India's long said that it would be best served if the United States just gets out of the region and lets it deal with Pakistan the way it wants to. Do you think that's the message Prime Minister Modi is going to be giving Joe Biden, or that Indians are starting to wonder, hey, maybe having someone to make sure things don't fall apart on our western border is not such a bad idea?
I think that that's exactly right. We've seen a test case, if you will, over the last 2 years of what happens when the U.S. really does pull back out of the region. And the depths to which the relationship has gone from being one of the top bilateral priorities to rarely coming up in terms of the bilateral relationship. The United States the disengagement with Pakistan has really been substantial. While there's been these little events here and there that may suggest that the relationship is still intact, it's really a minimum viable relationship at this point. And in some ways, one would expect that would be welcome in New Delhi. I think there is maybe sometimes a tendency to see those little events, visits or meetings between the U.S. and Pakistan, and assume maybe more is going on than actually is. But I do think that India would benefit from a more robust U.S. engagement with Pakistan. Not on the levels that we saw in the 20 years after 9/11, or during the 1980s, but one where the US maintains enough influence in Pakistan to help to mitigate some of the instability, and importantly, to continue to reinforce to the Pakistanis the need to rein in the militant proxies that they work with. I think that's actually in the US interest as well. If the US wants India to be focused on China, the one of the things that could derail that very easily is some kind of major attack in India that is traced back to Pakistan. So I think that it's actually both in US and India's relationship to increase for the US to increase its level of engagement with Pakistan, something I realize there's very little appetite to do these days.
Talking about very little appetite, Afghanistan still, it's almost descending into this Hobbesian nightmare. Some signs that the Russians are trying to edge their way in, gas fuel trucks being sent to Pakistan overland via Torkham, which is a very long journey from Russia through, former Soviet Central Asia in there. The Russians saying they're very worried about the Islamic State. But the United States really seems content if it were to let the Russians and the Chinese pick up the mess, the pieces of the mess they created. Would that be a fair assessment of the situation? And if it is, are you as a scholar worried about what that might mean in the slightly longer term as far as the stabilization of Afghanistan goes?
Yeah, Afghanistan has turned into an interesting anomaly in the international system right now because the US and China and Russia are competing for influence in so many countries. And Afghanistan is one of the places where the United States is essentially opted out of that kind of competition. Yes, there's still some humanitarian aid. Yes, there's still engagement, but there's no real effort to compete for influence in Afghanistan. And I am concerned with the degree of U.S. withdrawal, not just militarily, but in terms of its broader engagement from Afghanistan. I think it can become harder and harder to follow and understand what's going on in a country when you have that level of disengagement. And while most of the groups in Afghanistan are fairly weak in terms of their ability to strike the United States at this point, that you want to be able to closely monitor that over time. And even just recently, the UN has reported that the al-Qaeda leader Saif al-Adel has moved to Afghanistan, which would be another reason to want to make sure that there's a sufficient understanding, as well as some mechanisms to deal with the Taliban on cautions or raise concerns about the direction of these organizations. So if in terms of both Pakistan and Afghanistan, there is this real lack of interest, sort of a desire to close the book on that chapter. But there's still enough lingering issues that I think the United States has to stay engaged.
So one of the questions I have to you with Afghanistan, and this is sort of coming from an Indian perspective, where we obsessively watch Afghanistan for what it means for South Asian groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, but not so much at the wider context in the Middle East, what it means for ISIS globally or Al-Qaeda. Some reports in those leaked Discord documents about Afghanistan again becoming a base for plotting attacks on the West and elsewhere in the Middle East. Do you see that as a real threat? Because you do watch the bigger picture with these groups.
I mean, plotting is a threat. I think that there's a lot of intent by those organizations, but there's not yet much capability. And of course, you don't necessarily need a ton of capability for a very simple attack or to get lucky, essentially, and be able to execute something, but sort of large scale attacks. I think that kind of capability is still limited. And the groups that may have it, a group like the Islamic State in Khorasan and Afghanistan, also have divided attentions. And so it's not necessarily their number one priority. But where groups have intent and where they have space to build capability, those are the spaces that I worry the most about. And we do have that kind of situation in Afghanistan.
On China, you mentioned a lot of optimism in the United States, at least in some quarters, about India becoming a partner and in pushing back against Chinese power in Asia. We've noticed, though, over recent weeks that the United States is also entering into military relationships with other powers in Asia. And there's, of course, worry in India saying, if there is some crisis in the Pacific tomorrow over Taiwan or something else, India might find itself facing the brunt on the Himalayas. Is that understanding widespread in Washington? Because you mentioned that there were many people, and now a new generation of bureaucrats and administrators who didn't necessarily understand some of the nuances of India's problems, concerns, vacillations, if you like, on this issue.
Yes, and I think this is one of the reasons why the Ukraine war was probably had utility for this relationship in maybe a surprising way, which is that it was an instance where India took a position that corresponded with its interests, where the United States had to recognize what those interests are and calibrate that within this broader strategic partnership that it's creating. And so I think that was as difficult as it was for the relationship, it was an important moment for the United States to maybe more fully think about how India will respond in different scenarios, because it's not a partner who is simply going to follow the United States lead. And so I think that because of that, there was this sort of examination of some of the other questions that you raised, such as vis-a-vis Taiwan, and that there is probably more of an understanding of India's position on that as a result of some of the friction that came with Russia's war in Ukraine.
My final question, when this visit is done, the big headlines in India, and maybe slightly smaller headlines in the US, will be about billions of dollars worth of drones and jet engines and good things to do with supercomputers and so on. As someone who's watched government close up and studied it closely, are these kinds of sales things eventually going to be what really concern politicians? Or do you suspect there will be more substantial and serious conversations over developing and deepening the institutional relationships, particularly on things to do with intelligence cooperation and security? Do you have any suggestions for what ought to be done and isn't being done?
I think that these kinds of visits are really important forcing events, because leaders want to have things to show for these kinds of major meetings. So you will get some of those, as you say, splashy headlines in terms of the outcomes. But when a relationship is really reaching the next phase in terms of a bilateral relationships, it's when you see the kinds of institutionalization that you're talking about. And I think that has been slower to develop in some parts of the US government than others. I think on the defense side, we've seen more of that institutionalization of the relationship building. I think in some of the other realms, there's some work to do. And I think that there are continued constraints in some of these ways that US and India will have based on their different postures in the world. And as long as India remains fairly close and has an enduring relationship with Russia, that will mitigate some of the things that the United States is willing to do in areas like intelligence cooperation or certain kinds of defense equipment. So I think we're navigating a very careful path here that does require that institutionalization, but there will be some roadblocks to that because of these broader areas of friction within the relationship.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tricia, for taking the time again. And I look forward to having the opportunity to discuss this again with you at some point when the visit's done.